Good evening. Yaha. Hello. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Patrick Marks, and I run the Green Arcade bookstore across the street. Thank you. And I am hoping that if you've never been to the store and you just came to this event, that you will mosey right catty corner across the fabulous venue known as Market Street. We actually love being in this little nexus here. I want to thank Robin McCroskey-Azevedo, right over there, for hosting us tonight and letting us use this amazing space. It used to be an active factory manufacturer, a mattress manufactory, which has now since moved to the Central Valley. Also, her grandfather built this building in 1928, and it's still here. I also want to thank Rebecca Solnit for coming tonight to introduce, and also because Rebecca was our first Green Arcade event up here for her fantastic book, which actually the journalist Heather Smith worked on that, on the Infinite City San Francisco Atlas, and we do have copies over there at the long table. I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge that we are in San Francisco, based in Yelamu, the traditional unceded lands of the Ohlone people, and we pay our respect to elders both past and present. Also, there are restrooms over here, exits there and there, and there was a little bit of this is great news, in that the book, Sabrina Imbler's book, is being reprinted already, and the first printing is gone, so that is fantastic. Congratulations on a first book. So the copies that we have over here are the copies that we have, and I think Little Brown and through Hachette will be eventually having it available, I think even right at the beginning of the new year. So Rebecca Solnit, I guess you might say she had a varied literary career. She's still going on, and she's a writer, historian, activist, written over 20 books on various themes: feminism, Western Indigenous history, popular power, social change, insurrection, wandering, walking, hope and disaster, and then most recently Orwell's Roses, which we have over here, and a couple of really great little fairy tale books that are being retold. And they are just fantastic, and I actually have those over there as well. And then we will, Sabrina will be reading it also in conversation with the fabulous Heather Smith, who is right over there. Yeah. And she is a journalist. She writes about nature, about queer stuff, technology, and she is now the science editor at Sierra Magazine, so that's like kind of groovy. So we do have that book. We also have the first chapbook that was made by Sabrina, and they have had various fellowships and been writing a long time, and it's called Dyke Geology. And the book is just so amazing, I have to say. It's extremely moving and fun and deep. Of course, the ocean, it's about the ocean a lot, which is very deep. But I also just wanted to let you know that we were thinking, just because there's so much of the sea involved, that I brought, and actually David Lichvager is here tonight, and he has this amazing book, Octopus, Seahorse, Jellyfish, and we have copies of that, and he'd be glad to sign them as well afterwards. So without further ado, Rebecca Solnit, thank you.
Patrick. Thank you. Huge crowd we didn't really anticipate. This is fucking exciting. And so I think Patrick sort of introduced our, Heather and Sabrina, but I will say a few words because that seems to be my job. Sabrina wanted me to whittle their biography down to like staff writer at Defector, and but we'll get back to that. And so Heather was actually my student at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley 15 years ago, and I have taught in many places and taught many, many people, and Heather wrote the most beautiful sentences of any student I ever had and continues to do that, and manages to make things hilariously funny, kind of profound and poetically beautiful at the same time, which if you can figure out how to do that, you should do too, but you probably can't, sorry. And Heather stopped being a student and became a great friend, a contributor to our atlases, an editor at Sierra Magazine, which is how I know Sabrina's work, because Heather was publishing Sabrina. And I had this very funny thing about 6 weeks ago where I was supposed to do an event in New York City, and my somewhat slacker publishers were like, find your own interlocutor. And I was like, I don't know anybody in New York. And I was like, my best friend was out of town. Like, I couldn't think of this person. That person was busy. And then it was like, who's that amazing writer Heather's been publishing? I guess it's been a while since you published Sabrina. But so Sabrina obliged me, did an absolutely brilliant job of talking with Orwell's Roses with me. And I just thought, we should sort of return the favor and do something here. And Sabrina's from the Bay Area. Not everyone here went to school with them. And but I read this far in the book, and find it completely amazing, and also exemplary of something that's been happening for a little while, which is getting over the heteronormative wholesomeness of nature writing. And the ocean is a particularly magnificent place for all the literal fluidity of gender and sexuality and reproduction. And I just find it incredibly exciting that we no longer have people looking at these animals mate for life, we should all be heterosexual and married. Now that we know about cheating geese and homosexual penguins and, all these complex, subtle things that happen. And so I think this book is wonderful in itself, and also kind of an augury of all this wonderful change happening in how we think about the natural world in more complex, subtle, wide open ways. And there's just one paragraph on page 174 I want to read a little bit of that exemplifies it. Then I'll get out of the way and the show will begin. And Heather, do you want me to say the thing about cards, or do you? I can say the thing. Good. Okay. So she's talking about these creatures, and she says, but in water they exist in pulsating chains. Sorry, my pronoun apology. So they say, but in water they exist in pulsating chains that can curve like a snake or coil like a snail's shell. These chains are made up of hundreds of skeletal salps joined hip to jiggly hip. Each clone is a distinct barrel-shaped individual, yet all together the colony of clones makes up a single salp, attached and moving as one. Many chains can go as long as 20 feet, drifting through the ocean like giant quartzite bracelets. This is to say that individual identity is confusing for a salp, creatures for whom the notion of selfhood exists in the plural. For a salp, home is the rest of its salp. Maybe we're all a salp in this room. Heather, Sabrina, have fun. And thank you, everyone.
The cards thing is that we're going to be passing out cards to get questions, and so a card will be coming your way, and there will be a time when the card should move to the edge of the aisle and someone will come and collect them. I think right around the time I say one last question. But hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming out here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone so much for being here. It really is so special to see so many people from so many walks of life in one mattress company.
So I was hoping that we could start off with you reading a little bit from this book.
Yeah, so I was going to read, thank you, Heather, for suggesting I read from the first chapter of the book is about goldfish, which are not a sea creature. I apologize, it really is like 9 sea creatures in this book, but this is the essay that's about the Bay Area. The summer before I left for college, I volunteered on a research boat in San Francisco Bay. My job was to measure and identify every creature we caught. My first days on the boat, I was useless, squinting into the sea spray, my arms scorched red despite the blanket of fog that rolled over the bay. Everything on deck was slippery, and I kept dropping my clipboard. One by one, I scooped the fish up out of the tank and laid them flat against a clear ruler glued to a table by the tank. I smoothed out their thrashing, mucus-slicked bodies, talking to them as if I could coax them to lie still, which I never could. In my hands, the fish moved in a way I'd never seen bodies move before. Seconds of impeccable stillness, the only moving thing an eye, flickering wildly, and then the entire body would arch as the fish flung itself up into the air. Fish leaping, pirouetting, somersaulting into sky, and me scrambling after their landed bodies, cupping them in my hands until I could tip over the railing and plunge them back into the water. Some days we only caught anchovies and sardines, and my head spun distinguishing between 500, 600, 700 nearly identical creatures. But occasionally the nets would deliver us something wonderful. A speckled tonguefish, its 2 swiveling eyes looking directly at me as I measured it. California bat rays, wings flapping toward the rim of the tank as if they knew what flight was and wanted to try it. Once, we caught 2 baby leopard sharks, and I learned how to hold one, my left hand wrapped around the tail and my right cupping the spot below its small, jagged mouth. The shark wriggled, snake-like, but I held it firm and fast until it was time to let it go. Because the bay is an estuary, we caught fish that could live in brackish water. Starry flounders, chameleon gobies, staghorn sculpins that prickled their spines and jabbed you if you held them too tight. Someone once caught a white sturgeon, its skin the color of a pearl and its body more than 100 pounds. After I measured each fish, it was my job to throw them overboard. At first, I flung them off the side of the boat and turned around before I saw them splash. I imagined the cooling feel of the water against their scales, the rush of oxygen to their gills, disorientation for a moment, and then relief. It took me several days to realize that half the fish I threw overboard never made it back into the water, instead scooped up by a roving gang of gulls and ospreys that lurked around our boat. The ospreys watched me as I worked, talons gnarled around the white painted railings, and when I extended my arm overboard, fish in hand, they dove. When the birds crept too near my fish-laden tanks, I waved my slimy clipboard at them. Sometimes I shouted, spit flying, as I raced against the ospreys to pick up a fish that had flung itself out of the water and lay, gasping, on the deck. When I dumped the fish overboard, I leaned over the rails, as close to the surface I could get without falling, to watch their scales flash and disappear. On our way back to shore, I plunked my hundreds of anchovy measurements into a computer inside the plastic walls of the boat. And then I sat out on the deck and let the dried salt flake off my skin. I was always covered in scales after trolls. I would hold my arms up to the light and admire my iridescent, sweat-dewed fish skin. Deep in the bay, when the sky was clear, I felt like I could peer to the very curve of Earth, imagine it dipping, like I could see into all of my possible futures. What does it mean to survive in the wild? You can't do it without going wild yourself. We are all capable of reverting to a wilder state. The wild may sentence a cat or a dog to a starved life or early death, but for a goldfish, the wild promises abundance. Release a goldfish and it will never look back. Nothing fully lives in a bowl, it only learns to survive it. I will always be a little bit in love with feral goldfish. I know this is the wrong lesson to take from it all. I know they wreak an irreversible kind of havoc. They uproot bottom dwellers, trample ecosystems, sow tasseled parasites into the flesh of other fish. I know that once they take over a pond, they are impossible to extricate. I don't want a supremacy of goldfish, a world where fish the size of cantaloupes stampede through fragile ecosystems like wrecking balls. But when I think about ponds infested with gallon-big goldfish, I feel a kind of triumph. I see something that no one expected to live, not just alive, but impossibly flourishing and no longer alone. I see a creature whose present existence must have come as a surprise even to itself. Imagine having the power to become resilient to all that is hostile to us. Confinement, solitude, our own toxic waste. Salt, waves, 100-pound sturgeon that could swallow us whole. Imagine the freedom of encountering space for the first time and taking it up. Imagine showing up to your high school reunion, seeing everyone who once made you feel small, only now you're 100 times bigger than you once were. A dumped goldfish has no model for what a different or better life might look like, but it finds it anyway. I want to know what it feels like to be unthinkable too, to invent a future that no one expected of you. Because the Petco in Foster City is built on a landfill, it is sinking. The landfill is sinking faster than almost anywhere in California, creeping closer to the core of Earth. Each year, the city sinks by as much as 10 millimeters, and the sea rises by as much as 3 millimeters. This is a losing battle. For a long time, stony levees protected Foster City from the sea. Now, water splashes over the levees onto trails and doorsteps. Soon the waves will overtake the levees and flood the farms, the city, the factories, the military bases, the tourist towns, the freeways, and the Petco. The water may doom the cats, caged birds, leopard geckos, bunnies, hamsters, and guinea pigs. But I like to imagine the fish slipping out of their tanks, heading towards some unknowable horizon. Thank you.
Thank you. I have never read anything like this book before. Could you tell us a little bit about how it came to be?
Yeah, so I guess when the seeds of this book came to my mind, I was working for a product review company called Wirecutter, and I was reviewing toasters and air conditioner brackets. And I was having a really good time. It was like a really good first job. I made a fine wage. I had nice coworkers, but I think I felt sad that I wasn't doing science journalism, which was what I wanted to be doing this whole time. And I didn't really have any experience. I didn't really know how to get a job writing about animals, which is what I wanted to do. And so I thought maybe I could just sort of do it on my own time and do personal work that was about animals. And I saw this call for columns at this website called Catapult. And my friend Angela Chen, who's a wonderful science journalist, had this column called Data, where she sort of wrote about experiences from her own life and also musings on data and the ways that we use numbers in our lives. And I was like, I could do data, but instead of data, it's octopuses. And I had this job that I had while I was an intern at Audubon, and I was making $10 an hour, but I wanted to go out in New York. So I got this second job where I was writing clickbait for a nonprofit about the ocean, and I would write things like, you'll never guess where this seal found itself, and it was like a farm. Or you'll never believe how this handicapped goldfish got a new lease on life, and it's like its owner made it a sling so it could swim without a fin. And I was just writing these stories for $50 a story. And I would often come across stories about these creatures that in the ocean that I just wanted to write about in a more meaningful way. And one of those was this deep-sea octopus of the species Granuletini boreopacifica. And this octopus was recorded brooding its eggs for 4.5 years, which is when the octopus sits on its eggs and doesn't eat. And I was so moved by this story of this mother octopus, because after a mother octopus broods her eggs, she dies. And I wrote my little clickbait version of it, but it sort of stuck with me. And so that was the first entry in my column about sea creatures and the first model that I had for how I could tell my life alongside the sea creatures.
What about this particular chapter? Did you know when you started it how much time goldfish spend drinking their own pee?
Goldfish do spend a lot of time in their pee. They pee so much. And I knew this because I had a goldfish when I was in high school. It was a part of a science experiment in class, and then they were like, anyone who wants to take a goldfish can just take one. And I was like, I will take the goldfish. And then I kept it in a bowl, and I knew deep down that it was sad in some way. It just like was this one goldfish in a bowl, and so I like Googled like, what does a goldfish need to be happy? And it was like a 30-gallon tank, and I was like, I don't have that. And so then I asked my dad to drive me to the Japanese tea garden in San Mateo, and I released my goldfish Quincy. I hope that's not illegal. No one tell. But I think even then I was like, what a goldfish needs is like a 30-gallon tank, and like that is what it deserves, and I'm not going to have a goldfish again until I can give it those conditions. But then once I started writing the story, which was at first just a story about my experience in high school and sort of not seeing a lot of models for perhaps the life that I wanted to lead, and not realizing like I was queer for a very long time, that's when I learned about feral goldfish, which are goldfish that are just released in rivers and lakes and just grow to the size of like milk jugs. And I was like, wow, like this is the most amazing thing I've ever learned about. And also like my own bias, clearly, like I thought that the best life a goldfish could aspire to was like being in a 30-gallon tank, and it's like, no, the goldfish wants to be in a fucking river. It wants to be swimming with its kind. And so it was something I learned during the writing.
I really hope this is what happened for Quincy.
I've checked the San Mateo Tea Garden. I haven't seen him, so I like to think he's in the Pacific Ocean, taking on a shark.
So there's another story in actually the chapter that Rebecca read from, where you are at Reese Beach and there are these like mysterious disco blobs that are everywhere, and you go on this quest to discover what they are, where they're coming from, and well into this quest, you meet this guy named Ranger Dave, who tells you that actually you should not be seeking the blobs, and instead you should be writing about this dead whale that Ranger Dave thinks is the most interesting thing that ever happened. And so I'm wondering, is this a metaphor in any way for your overall life as a science journalist? And also, how did you actually find out that they were SELPs, as Rebecca mentioned?
That's a wonderful question. So yeah, one of the essays is about me at Reese Beach, which is the queer beach in New York, and me being. I went there one September, and there were all of these like strange, like boba-shaped, clear, gelatinous blobs, and I was like, "This is amazing!" And it was so surreal because this beach is like a beach where queer people go to be themselves, to have fun, to like drink a lot of tequila, and here they were, like these hot gay people doing citizen science, being like, this is fish eggs, or like, these are baby jellyfish. And I was like, I feel so bad that I do not know the answer to this. And then several years passed, and then it was the pandemic, and I had to write my book, which was really hard to do. And I remembered this experience, and I remembered seeing those blobs and like swimming with them in the ocean, and how special that was. And so then I was like, I'll email the people who would know what these blobs are, like Ranger Dave of Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge Center. And Ranger Dave emailed me back to say, and like I had done some Googling. I was like, clear gelatinous blobs, like dime-sized, New York, like Atlantic Ocean. And I thought that they were SELPs, which are these creatures, as Rebecca read, are both colonial and individual. So one SELP is both a chain of clones and also a single SELP, which is amazing. And I was like, what a cool metaphor for like queer community. And Ranger Dave was like, I don't think they're SELPs. Like, I think they're comb jellies. And I was like, that's not what I want to write about. But I think I was thinking about queer history, the queer history of Reese, and how, like, sometimes I think speculation and fabulation in history can be a way of, recognizing, like, real queer histories that might not have been recorded by, like, the New York Times, but, like, certainly did exist. And so I wanted to write about them as if they were SELPs and to try to understand SELPs. And then, like, last year, after I had, like, written this whole essay where I, like, decide to call them SELPs, I was taking this queer surfing lesson, not at Reese, but at another beach in the Rockaways, and I had just surfed for the first time, and it was like this amazing experience. I didn't think that I could surf, but I stood up like every single time, and I like waved to everyone. I don't know if they waved back, but I was having an amazing time. And then after I like finished surfing, I walked along the shore, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw the blobs, and they were the same blobs. It was like the size of boba with a tiny like little circle inside, and I was losing my mind. And so I picked up the blobs and I like ran back to the tent and I showed my partner T and like all these other people who were at the Queer Surf Club, and I was like, the blobs, they're here. And then one of the people who organizes this Queer Surf Club, his name is Momo, they just looked at me and they were like, those are salps. And I was like, I just lost my mind. And I was like, of course, this whole time, like, the answer was with a gay person and not like Ranger Dave of the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. But I guess to fully answer your question, I do think it is emblematic of a lot of my experiences in science journalism, where I feel like I develop intense connections with things that have no face, and maybe don't receive the kind of conservation funding that like a panda does, or maybe don't hold like the secret to curing cancer, and so therefore no one really spends a lot of time studying them. Like, they don't make like big feature stories, but I love those creatures and I care about them. So I think it's been a project over the course of my career to sort of get people to let me write about the faceless and the gelatinous.
I'm so glad that you had this moment of vindication.
It was really special.
Okay, so for me, this book is officially queer canon. Like, this is the book that I wish I could go back in time and give to my really confused young self. And so I was wondering, what was queer canon for you, whether or not you recognized it as such when you were younger?
Oh my God. That's an amazing question, and I have to say the answer is Free Willy. Which is a movie that I saw as a child, and I think I was inspired by the message of like freeing Willy, Willy the whale. But I saw it in college with my girlfriend at the time, and I think I was able to understand that I had an immense crush on Lori Harvey. Is that the actress's name?
I've never seen Free Willy.
Lori Petty. Also great on Orange is the New Black. But she just wears like a wetsuit for a lot of the movie and is like touching whales. And it's very gay.
I really have to see this movie now. I've like never had the urge before.
I also realized Lori Harvey is the daughter of Steve Harvey, which I said because I listened to Who Weekly like too much.
No, Lori Petty's definitely like excellent work in Tank Girl as well in terms of queer iconography.
Is that a movie where she's in a tank of water?
Ooh,
Oh,
that
no,
would
it's
be
like
even
a
better.
tank.
No,
I was
that
like
would
a
be-
fish tank.
No,
It's the 30-gallon fish tank with Lori Petty and goldfish.
I'm editing a water tank into my memories of that movie right now. Yeah. Okay, so one thing that I really love about your science journalism in general is that you get these completely weird quotes from scientists. Like, I was just reading back through the archives, and there was one guy who described the Devonian as like the literal flop era. And I'm wondering, like, is this like a rare and special thing? Like, how often does this happen with scientists?
Yeah, that's a fun question. The guy who described the Devonian as the flop era, their name is Ben O'Toole, and he is a graduate student at the University of Chicago studying early tetrapods, so like the first fish that sort of left the water or came close to it, which meant that it was literally a time of like flopping, like they didn't really have real legs, so they just kind of like flopped around the shore, vibing. But I like in that quote, it was all Ben. It was all Ben's doing. But I think I get fun quotes because I talk to graduate students who are fun and young and hip and like love the opportunity to talk to a journalist. Whereas I feel like more like PIs or like very senior researchers, like they have to speak to so many people and they're like done with it. And I feel like for a graduate student, they're still like in the phase where they love their job sometimes. And so yeah, I feel like it's I try to just have a conversation with people and sort of often like ask them like how something makes them feel. And I feel like that's a good way to get the fun quotes out.
So the first thing that we ever worked on was this. I asked you to write a review of A Life on Earth, which was David Attenborough doing a documentary about David Attenborough. And Sabrina did this amazing job that both like was totally loving and just devastating, and compared David Attenborough to a cake that was falling apart. And I think part of like the devastating part is just that you were writing so honestly about climate change and biodiversity loss, but you were also being incredibly funny at the same time. And I feel like that's something that very few writers ever pull off, because it's such emotionally tough territory to go through. And so I was wondering if you have any advice on navigating this as somebody who does it a lot.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think in the process of writing this book, like a lot of the creatures that I write about are endangered or have, their populations have been greatly reduced to what they were when like Western civilization didn't just wreck the oceans. And so there was a lot of, I guess, like, it was often very sad to do the research of this book. It was both like sad and full of wonder at the same time, which I feel like are two emotions that I often hold in twain when I'm doing my work. Like, at my job at Defector, which is a worker-owned company, everyone should subscribe. I do a lot of stories on like weird little guys who are just kind of doing their thing, like frogs that can't land their jumps, or like weird little bugs, or like ancient wombats that are now extinct but were really, really big when they were alive, which we love to see. And a lot of these stories, like, especially, I don't know, I've been writing a lot about frogs recently, and frogs are in deep trouble, like everywhere, because they're, I know it's very sad, but they're amphibians, and they like are so sensitive to toxins in the water, to toxins in the air, like they breathe through their skin, and lots of little tiny frogs, like the frog that can't jump well, they've sort of they've evolved in isolation on these various mountaintops in like Brazil's Atlantic forest, and it is, a region that's being deforested a lot, and so it's kind of like whatever scientific research about these frogs come out, it's accompanied by like, well, these frogs could all be extinct in like the next couple of decades, and it's a hard pivot to be like, nah, this frog jumps funny, to like, well, like enjoy it while it lasts, but I feel like it is important to tell these two parts of the same story like together, because it both like, I hope, encourages people to appreciate the frog and like really recognize like there are all these amazing creatures all around us on Earth, like just doing their own thing, and their thing is so strange, and like it is a joy and an honor to learn about what they do. And at the same time, like the decisions that a lot of our governments are making are like endangering their future and endangering their survival. So I think it is never, I don't know, I think I always try to bring both of those to the same story, and to sort of see wonder as a route into empathy and a route into care. And that wonder can also be like, this frog looks stupid.
I guess, what would you like to do next? Like, what's your dream project?
I'm writing a fan fiction.
Is it about ammonite?
No, Heather edited a really wonderful story, or it was so fun to work on. It was like a review of the Ammonite. I don't know if anyone saw Ammonite. It was this like historical lesbian movie about a blonde woman and a brunette woman being very cold in England, and they were so sad, and there were only candles, so everything is really dark. And I like watched the screener on my laptop, and I was like, turn the brightness up. I couldn't see anything. And Kate Winslet just like eats like meat pasties. Like she's cold on the beach and she like hammers a rock, and then she like takes a bite of her pasty and she like puts it back in her pocket. And I'm like, your tools are in that pocket. Like, what is the pasty touching? Anyway, I'm writing a fan fiction that is inspired by this real life person named Ann Lister, who's like the subject of this HBO series Gentleman Jack, which I don't like and lots of people do like, and that is fair. But it is like, she was a real lesbian in like the 1800s, and she sort of wrote about her exploits like in these diaries, and they were all full of code, and one person cracked them and they were like, she was a lesbian, and everyone's like, let's make a mini-series. But she was like a landlord, and she was like trying to get, like, she was like really into like oil exploitation from her land, and I'm like, I don't know if I stan her. But when I was reading about her, because I just love to read about like historical queer people, I learned that she has, when she was younger, she lived in a boarding house in England somewhere, and she lived in the attic with like another pupil who was a half white, half Indian girl named Eliza, and they were girlfriends. And then when they broke up, Ann Lister had Eliza like institutionalized, because that was just like something that people did back then, like mostly men, but also like lesbian landlords did that to get rid of their exes. And I was like, Eliza deserves a revenge story. So that's my fan fiction. I don't know if it'll see the light of day, but I'm excited to sort of try something in a different genre.
I'm so excited for this. Like, I too do not like Gentleman Jack. I was like, she's an oil baron?
She's an oil baron.
She's always collecting rent from peasants? Yeah, no, revenge, definitely. Okay, so I have one more question. So if you wrote down a question, now is your time to sort of ferry it to the edge, and Audrey with the magnificent hair will be collecting them.
Thank you, Audrey. What magnificent hair.
Okay, so basically, now is the time. Are there any sea creatures that did not make it into your book that you would like to give a shout out to at this moment?
Thank you for that question. Yes. There was one. So when you pitch like a nonfiction book, you often sell it on proposal, which means that you don't have to have actually like written the book before they buy it, which is very dangerous if you are good at like pitching things but not good at writing them. And one of the essays that I pitched was called Meet the Guy Fieri of Sea Slugs. And it was supposed to be an essay about Guy Fieri and a sea slug that I thought looked like him. It's called Genalis fuscus. Everyone should Google it. But it's like a clear sea slug, and then it has these like little kind of like spikes, like soft spikes on its back, and each of the spike it crowns in this little like white stripe and then a yellow stripe. And when I saw that, I was like, frosted tips. Like this sea slug has frosted tips. And then when I tried to write the essay, there wasn't really much beyond the connection that I thought that the sea slug looked like Guy Fieri. So we scrapped it. But sea slugs are one of my favorite creatures. They're so beautiful and toxic, and there's so many of them in the tide pools around the bay, if anyone is into tide pooling. And I love that they steal their stinging cells from the things that they eat. I think that they're very resourceful, and I respect that.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm just having a moment.
Yeah.
I guess, do you have any advice for young queer science writers who are thirsty to forge their own path? Not that would be a thirst thing necessarily.
No, I mean, I feel like we should pivot the word thirsty back into like a more expansive definition. Yeah, I mean, I guess as someone who has been at a lot of different sort of traditional science publications, like, and felt very lonely at a lot of them, it felt almost like coming home to like write for Heather at Sierra. Like it was such a wonderful, generative, and like safe relationship, and I felt like I could really lean into like my perversions about David Attenborough or historical like lesbian nature movies. But I think the experience that I've had like working with other queer people in science journalism or in media in general is like I never want to work for somewhere where I don't feel like I can just be myself and like I can bring my politics like to that workplace, and where I can like take certain stances that might be frowned upon at a more traditional newsroom. And I think as much as you can, like I would remember like what you care about and not try to compromise those values depending on what is asked of you at like a mainstream outlet or whatever outlet you work at. And to remember that, I don't know, you should never feel like you have to be less of a human to do your job.
I will say that when that Ammonite essay came in, I was like, will this make it through? Like, I just kind of played it cool. Oh, perfect. Can I?
Yeah, I think the last like paragraph of the Ammonite essay was like two Ammonites who I made lesbians who were like kissing.
All right. Okay. Oh, which sea creature is the most queer, in your opinion?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to speak in superlatives because the ocean is such like a queer space with so many different ways of like having sex and being of a sex and then changing to another sex. Like clownfish live in these small communities where everyone is a male except for one big female, and then when that female like dies or leaves a little community, the next biggest male will become a female, which is like a very special way, I think, of thinking about gender, of like sort of filling gaps. But I think the queerest sea animal is probably, in my eyes, the cuttlefish, which is just like a really cool little creature that can change its appearance in so many ways and also change the texture of its skin. And I guess in writing the book, I read a lot of science coverage about cuttlefish that would talk about sort of like a male cuttlefish's ability to take on like a female cuttlefish appearance as like devious cuttlefish, like Dawn's drag disguise to secure mate. And a lot of sort of annoying like human frames on these really cool and weird creatures. And I like the idea that like none of this, like a cuttlefish is never in disguise, right? It's just like showing a different way that it has to appear. And so I liked that about the cuttlefish. And so I now deem it the queerest animal in the ocean.
Oceans are queer. What else in nature are we heteronormatizing that we should take a second look at?
Wow. I think my answer to this is that you should read the book Evolution's Rainbow by Joan Roughgarden, which will list like every queer animal in much better detail than I could ever give. But bonobos.
Why did you decide to pursue science writing instead of becoming a scientist and/or a scientist/science writer?
Wow. Well, I can't do math. Really, I just can't do it. So I never really thought about being a scientist beyond like wanting to be a marine biologist, as a child. And I like being a science writer because I guess you just get to learn about so many different creatures, but you don't actually have to like analyze data. You just get to talk to people and like learn about a bug, and then the next week you're learning about like a cool turtle. I'm sorry if you hope for a deeper answer, but I can't do math.
We have a technique answer, question. If you get writer's block, what do you do to get unstuck?
That's a great question. I eat a snack. I think one of my favorite things to do is watch the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's live stream of the Okeanos Explorer, which is like a deep sea ROV that will just go into the deep sea, and then they'll live stream like what the ROV is seeing, and there'll be scientists like commentating on top of it. And it almost feels like ASMR, but like science ASMR, because you can just sort of play it in the background, and they'll be like, oh, a jellyfish, zoom in, about 10 centimeters. What do you think that is? Globulella. And it's just like, I don't know, it's like you never know what you're gonna see. There's always something new to encounter. They're so relaxed, and I think sometimes I use this as writer's block, sometimes I use this like to find a new idea, but I feel like just watching like a live stream of scientists shooting the shit, I feel like is really helpful.
If we love your work, who else and what else should we check out? Insert product recs here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a book that I do absolutely want to recommend is a book called Voice of the Fish by Lars Horn, which came out in June with Grey Wolf, and it is a memoir of transition and the body told through fish. And when I heard that it was coming out, I was like, no! But it's a very different book, and it's also a lot about like antiquity, and Lars is British, so there's like Britishisms. And it's a very, I would say, like beautiful, critical, and rigorous look at like the body and ability and fish like in mythology. So if you like this or are interested in this, you'll probably love that. And then also Undrowned by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. The full title is Undrowned: Black Feminist Lessons for Marine Mammals, and it's like this gorgeous guidebook about lessons in activism and feminism and like care for yourself told through the ways that different marine mammals survive and thrive on the ocean. It's really beautiful.
And so what do you think is the most moving experience you've had while doing science journalism?
Wow. That's a very big question. I guess when it was the pandemic, I was writing this story about leaf insects, which are insects that look like leaves. And there was this study that came out that basically found that an insect that looked like a stick that people thought was one species, and an insect that looked like a leaf that people thought were another species were actually the same species, and it was just like the male was the stick and the female was the leaf. And I was like, that's so fun. And so then I interviewed these scientists, and it was this young guy named Royce Cumming who was like just entering the leaf bug business, and then this much older man, Stéphane Le Tyrant, who is French-Canadian, who was like, showed me, he was like, I have 10,000 beetles in my home. And I was like, okay, you've been in this business for quite some time. But it was really beautiful. I think it was this moment where it was like everyone felt really lonely and like sort of unsure of what was going to happen. And it was really special to hear about sort of these two people who have found both like immense intellectual passion in studying like leaf insects and also like a deep friendship that I found so touching and like contagious. And I think it's always fun when like the science is really cool, but then also everyone is just having a great time. I think it comes across in how they talk about it. And I don't know, I think a lot of the stories that I wrote during the pandemic when I was just like in my New York apartment and like really feeling so far away from like the natural world and the ocean and creatures, just like being able to talk with people and like see them, like have them show me like a preserved parasitic worm from the deep sea, like that they have on their desk, like put it up to the zoom, and I'm like, nice. Like that was really moving.
All right, well, I think we're pretty much, maybe just one more question. Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, so we've got a couple technique questions. Maybe, did you start most often with the sea creature or yourself?
It really varied on the essay. So some essays, like the octopus essay, I first learned about the octopus and I was like, I have to find a way to write about this. And then I sort of searched inward for like, why do I feel so connected to this? And like, how can I look into that to find maybe what the essay is about? There were essays like the Salp essay at Reese where I found a creature in a space that was sort of in conversation with that creature. And then there were other essays where, like for one of the essays, I knew that I wanted to write about queer nightlife and queer like clubbing that I really found refuge in a time like right after Trump got elected and I'd moved to a new city and I felt really alone and scared and like so far away from like people who really nourished me. And so then I was like, what's a creature that looks gay? And then I found this crab that lives in the deep sea called the Yeti crab, which has these big claws that sort of, I thought at the time looked like feather boas. And I was like, that's a gay crab. Maybe this will be my like cipher into writing about queer nightlife. And then I guess the more I wrote about it, the more I was like, wow, like this crab lives in like oases, in hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, which are just like oases of warmth and life and community, like in what is otherwise like barren, like freezing temperatures. And I was like, that reminds me a lot of like finding the one like gay bar in like a city and like going there every weekend, like, and just like knowing that that is like the space that feels like home and the space that feels safe. And then I learned that there was this one species of Yeti crab that actually like dances to farm its own bacterial meadows on its claws. It just like waves its little claws back and forth in the heat of the hydrothermal vents, and then it like farms bacteria, then it eats the bacteria off its claws. And I was like, this crab is literally dancing like in my essay about queer nightlife, like I'm a genius. So yeah, I wish there was like a plan, but they just sort of came naturally.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has just been such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Heather and Rebecca and Patrick. Oh yeah, yeah. I'll be signing books here.
It's so masterpiece theater.